As I mentioned before, many of these women wrote memoirs that were never published, which gives such insight into their lives and struggles, as well as to the work they wanted to do before the blacklist took place.
Listeners, if you thought the topic of blacklisting had been exhausted in TV and film and books, well, know that there's at least one stone that had remained unturned until quite recently, and that is the impact of blacklisting and what it had on the budding TV industry, and specifically women. This season of Advanced TV Herstory, 4 episodes in all, includes segments of an extended interview with Dr. Carol Stabile of the University of Oregon and dozens of names you've never heard of. You'll also hear from another author and scholar, Dr. Charlene Regester of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I am grateful to Dr. Regester for our frank conversation about how racism further changed the course of early TV. You won't find this anywhere else. This is Advanced TV Herstory, and I'm your host, Cynthia Demas Abrams. In Episode 1, Dr. Stabile walked us through the blacklist, not only as we know it from our classes, movies, and books, but also the toxic masculinity that sought out and ruined progressive women who were on the cusp of transitioning careers in film or stage or radio to TV. Now, mind you, and you're going to hear more in many cases, I'm using air quotes, progressive is defined as either being of color, Jewish, a lesbian or bisexual, or an advocate for civil rights or workplace conditions. That's considered progressive. In an attempt to retain power and control in post-war America, former FBI agents understood the tools of surveillance and how readily smears and innuendo could suppress critics of all sorts. This is the stock and trade that they had used in World War II, and, it worked then, and it could certainly work now, domestically. Now, Stabile has written a book. It's called The Broadcast 41, and it is supported by extensive research and scores of FBI reports that had been compiled on TV women that she has requested and received over the last 10 years. It is exhaustive and exhausting, to tell you the truth, but a definite read. Definitely put it on your list. Now, as Stabile explained in the first episode, the first Red Scare, the anti-communist movement which occurred during the World Wars, that sort of set the stage for how it is that in the United States we can hold such thoughts against other Americans. The second Red Scare emerged from the efforts of 3 former FBI agents, and it mushroomed with the publication of a small but powerful document, very, very strategically written and distributed, and it's called Red Channels, the Report of Communist Influence in Radio and Television. So this Red Channels document, why don't we in modern day America even know that this was a thing?
It's interesting. I mean, you can still apparently buy copies for $500 on eBay, and some libraries still have copies in special collections.
You've read one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what was your feeling? How did you feel when you were reading it through, in your heart?
Part of it was a kind of abject terror, I'll be honest with you, because when I talk to my students about this, I say, think of it this way. You signed a change.org petition when you were 22, right? And I don't know what it was for. Maybe it was, against climate change or, for a living wage in your community or healthcare for all, whatever. 12 years later, someone lists you in a report suggesting that you're advocating for the revolutionary overthrow of the U.S. government on the basis of the petition that you signed. So reading the document and looking at the list of organizations that were next to people's names, and also thinking about the impact that the publication of this book had on people's careers, it was really chilling.
Chilling.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you when you saw it?
That's funny. The first time I saw Red Channels, it was just on the shelves in the library at the university I was teaching at. And so I pulled it off the shelf, and I wanted to know more about who was creating television in the early 1950s, because I'd been thinking about this is a long time ago, it's the family values debate in the Murphy Brown episode in 1992, where Dan Quayle, accused Murphy Brown of how did he put it? She was kind of making a mockery of fatherhood by having a child out of wedlock. And so I've been thinking about this, and that led me to think, well, who was writing those shows that people like him are referencing from the 1950s that are kind of icons of family values? That led me directly to Red Channels. And as soon as I was going through the pages, I remember sitting in the library, going through the pages and just saying, this is really interesting, because in an industry dominated by men, there are 41 women who are listed in this volume, and I don't know any of their names, or I knew very few of their names. You know, maybe out of the 41 women, I knew the names of maybe 7. 2
of them being Lillian Hellman and Dorothy Parker.
Right.
Again, you saw a gap when you were kind of pondering the whole Murphy Brown thing. And I mean, you know, you it's not hard to see gaps, but what you found then was there was this list of 41 women, many names that were not even recognizable. And this was the 50s. Well, wait a second. The 50s emerged out of the 40s, and that's when Rosie the Riveter, you know? I mean, you can understand that the manufacturing jobs, that men wanted those jobs back. And you can understand the pressure that was put on rank and file women to just go back to what that was. And maybe many of them wanted to. Maybe that was too much change in middle America. But we're talking about the hallways of New York and that burgeoning, bustling industry of television, which was built out of radio and sort of ran alongside and was growing alongside of film. Technology, there was no shortage. There was no shortage of opportunity as television was coming to pass. And yet here we are in retrospect. What is part of the folklore of the 50s in America? Well, by golly, if you think of the 50s and you don't think of Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, then I think you're un-American. That's kind of what you get told, right?
Now, you likely have some knowledge of the Honeymooners, but probably have never heard of the first Alice Cramden, Pert Kelton.
Let's talk a little bit about, in a gig on TV, being Pert Kelton, who was 43 years old when Red Channels was published. Pert Kelton was actually the first Alice Cramden. Dumont Radio, and then later Dumont TV, had created the Honeymooners. But Alice Cramden had to be the balance to Jackie Gleason, to being that balance to a very, very powerful character. Pert Kelton was the original Alice Cramden, and then all of a sudden wasn't.
That's how quickly it happened too, right? Is that you could have a gig that seemed like a done deal and a good bet for years to come. And then the day after, it could be taken away from you altogether. And that's what happened to her. She was in the comedy sketches that originally appeared on the Dumont Television Network's Cavalcade of Stars, which were the origins of the Honeymooners. But when it was announced that that she was going to appear in the TV series, again, anti-communists organized around it, she appeared in the original sketches, but then was very quickly replaced, as you know, by Audrey Meadows. And that, you know, like a lot of people, that was very much the end of her career. She wasn't young. She was a particular kind of comedic actress, and that combination meant that there wasn't going to be work for her in the 1950s.
I'm guessing 50s television would have been more fun to watch if Pert Kelton and Audrey Meadows could have offered their wit and timing to audiences, likely opening the door to women comedy writers who, in real life, were really only welcomed into the writer's room when the creators of the Mary Tyler Moore Show recruited them. 18 years later. And we know that women didn't break into television news until affirmative action required networks and stations to hire women and persons of color in the late 60s. But imagine if Lisa Sergio had graced the early years of network news.
While many of these women got their start in radio, Lisa Sergio pretty much only lived in radio. What's her story?
Lisa Sergio was known as a golden voice of Rome. She was born in Rome. Her mother was American. Her father was Italian. She grew up in Italy, and she worked as a journalist during the early years of Mussolini's rise to power. She worked for the fascist government. She became increasingly critical of Mussolini, And when she began translating his speeches in a way that was critical, she got word from the government she was going to be arrested by the fascists and imprisoned. So she's spirited out of Italy by her uncle, who just happens to be the inventor of the telegraph, Marconi. She comes to New York City and she gets a job working for WNBC. She's a news commentator. She hates it because she thinks that WNBC isn't going to promote a woman or let a woman do the news. So she gets another job. And from 1939 to 1945, she has her own radio show called Lisa Sergio's Column of the Air. And it's this brilliant and erudite analysis of world events. And this is back in the day where if you did the news, you wrote the news. Mm-hmm. You didn't just read words that someone else had written. Mm-hmm. So Lisa Sergio's writing this analysis of world events, broadcasting it, 7 days a week during World War II. End of World War II, she gets fired. And the blacklist hits her hard. The FBI has her under very intense surveillance. J. Edgar Hoover is spreading rumors that she was the mistress of Mussolini's son-in-law, alternately that she was sleeping with, most of the sort of fascist literati. He makes it difficult for her to even get speaking gigs, because anti-communists write to places where she's supposed to be giving talks and demand that they pull the support from her. I should just say about Sergio was particularly vulnerable because, to the best of my knowledge, she was a woman-identified woman. She didn't have intimate relationships with any men, which make J. Edgar Hoover's rumors even more egregious. And so I think that women in her situation were doubly fearful that their sexualities might be outed too.
Sure.
And they would take an additional reputational hit because of that.
Right. So you were either somebody's mistress or you were involved with women, and either way you weren't going to win.
A postscript on Sergio? Google her till the cows come home, and what you'll most likely find her credited on is a series of short films about family matters from the late 50s produced by the United Methodist Church. Isn't that a waste of talent? Isn't that a woman whose opportunities were limited? Her recognition. Now, remember that Stabile talked about all of her research into the vision that many of these women had, that television held the power to educate and entertain, bringing the classics in the classroom to American living rooms. Wouldn't that have been a different day? Before Liberace or Lawrence Welk, there could have been Ray Lev.
Now, Ray Lev, by the time Red Channels landed, was only 38 years old. Lived another 18 years after that, but pianist, Russian-born. Tell us about Ray.
Who'd have thought, right? I mean, again, this is one of those cases where trying to figure out why the FBI was so interested in her and why she even appeared in this list of people who were to be blacklisted from television is kind of a mystery to me still. She was a very, very well-known classical pianist. She played many, many times at Carnegie Hall. She toured Europe. She played for the Queen. She'd been a child prodigy. She was also a very outspoken advocate for civil rights. She said, as a member of a minority herself, she felt a special obligation to make sure that she stood up for and defended civil rights. The FBI initiates a file on her after Red Channels is published, and for the next 18 years, they amass a file on her that adds up to over 400 pages. They prevented her from touring Europe, which was one of the ways that people could still make money, especially performers, because the blacklist didn't impact their popularity in places like that. So she couldn't get a passport. She had to resort to taking students and teaching in order to make ends meet. And her FBI file ends in, I believe it's 1968. The last entry is a detailed account of her suicide. The FBI observes that they can close the file.
Listeners, the stories of all 41 of these women deserve to be told, and Stabile does it in the book. In the first episode of this podcast, I touched briefly on Lillian Hellman, who was one of the 41, and she was a white woman. Pert Kelton was a white woman, and both of them were American-born. Sergio and Lev were both foreign-born.
The Red Scare had precious little to do with communism and much more about preserving the status quo of the American power structure post-World War II. And if that weren't so, then Hazel Scott would be a household name today. She would be an icon. She would have preceded Diana Ross as the most prolific African-American woman performer who would have seeded a very different musical sound of the 60s.
If you are seasoned TV historians, would like to think that Diane Carroll was really the first African-American woman who was the title-named character of a TV series. And TV historians would be mostly right, except for the fact that there was this incredible opportunity called The Hazel Scott Show. And The Hazel Scott Show never came to be because of the blacklist. And before Carol gets into a little bit more about Hazel Scott, picture Alicia Keys at the 2019 Grammys. Michelle Obama has just come out and just absolutely captivated America and the world. And then Alicia Keys sits down and plays two pianos at the same time. And in fact, shouted out and gave recognition to the legacy of Hazel Scott. Hazel Scott could do that and did that for years and years. And that was part of her show personship. That was part of her act. So help us understand Hazel Scott and being on the cusp of being the Hazel Scott Show, which would have preceded Julia by 15 years, give or take.
Yeah. I just want to tell one story about Hazel Scott because I was working in her papers, which are at the Schomburg in New York City. So she was an incredible performer. She was the first African-American to have their own variety show. But another thing happened in 1950 that I think is really important to note. She was still performing for U.S. troops in 1950, and she was traveling in the Pacific Northwest with a companion. They just got off a military plane, and their first stop was Pasco, Washington. In a documentary, Scott told the story about what happened. She said, she was exhausted. She was really sick. She had a terrible cold. And they stopped at a restaurant to get some soup. And the waitress refused to serve them because she said, quote, they were Negroes. So what Scott does is she told her friend, I said, and this is a quote from Scott, I said, come on, we're going to the police station. Around the corner and up the street we went, where I looked into a pair of the coldest green eyes I've ever seen in my life. And when I told him what had happened, he said, are you going to get out of here, or am I going to run you in for disturbing the peace? They left and went to their hotel, where Scott picked up the phone, called her agent, and said, I want the following things in the following order: a hot bath, a hot drink, and a lawyer. I sued and I won, and I gave all the money to the NAACP. So this is what's happening also in 1950, right? Is that Hazel Scott is standing up for civil rights, as she had throughout her career. Historian Dwayne Mack said that the victory that she won in Spokane, Washington, helped challenge discrimination
and
throughout throughout the Pacific Northwest, and that it helped inspire civil rights organizations to pressure the Washington state legislature to enact the Public Accommodations Act in 1953. I should say that the Hazel Scott Show ran from July 1950 through mid-September of 1950 to critical acclaim. It was canceled a week after Hazel Scott appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
There are 3 reasons why I won't recap the trashed lives and careers of all 41 TV women. First, you won't have a reason to go out and buy Dr. Stabile's book. You won't have a reason to go to her website, broadcast41.com, and see how you can get one ordered and put in your mailbox next week. The Broadcast 41. It gives you the depth, and it tells their stories in the richest possible detail because Dr. Stabile has it all researched and recounted. Second reason is, quite honestly, it's a bummer to tell these stories. This is too much for one sitting. And third, because in some cases, there is so precious little available about these women's careers or their points of views or biographies that it was refused to be acknowledged this painful time in their lives in their Wikipedia profiles or whatever. Dr. Stabile is finding out on the total backside because she's seeing these files from archives, from archives that have been left in libraries, that have been left to museums, as well as the FBI files that she's requested. So she's getting all of this information, which hasn't necessarily been brought into the public view by the person, by the woman who was originally hurt, or her family. And it's often said that the veterans of World War II came home and they never spoke about what they saw. It's one of the reasons why it's called the silent generation. But think about it. The other half, the women of that generation who worked so hard to get us through World War II, they also didn't talk much about what they experienced. We really know little about their work and their dreams and even the safety that was all trampled in the years following the war. The years where they thought there was going to be great opportunity, the freedom that they had fought for was now finally going to come to them as well because they had all done this together. And those are the years that we romanticize, or many want to romanticize now, as great. Well, they weren't so great. I'll tell you the story of one of the 41, a woman named Madeline Lee Gifford. And she was a smart, funny comic actress who married Jack Gilford, who was also a comic, and maybe you've heard of him. They were both blacklisted, and Jack's career slowly returned with commercials and a few small memorable parts. In 2006, due to the wonders of YouTube, I found this, their son interviewed his mother, Madeline, about all of her memories, about projects, about plays that they had been in and things that they had done, and even the blacklist. Madeline spoke at length about the damage of her husband's career, but she didn't mention the damage it did to her own. She noted every effort to restore his name in Hollywood, but never mentioned her own pain or disappointment. That's the mindset of this generation of women. Now, the last profile in this episode is a talent who would have made television herstory if she had been put in charge, literally, of anything.
The last one we're going to focus on is more of a recognizable name for many. If you've seen shows over the years, you may recognize the name of Ruth Gordon. And Ruth Gordon is perhaps the most celebrated performer, actor in this whole group. She had earned an Emmy. She had been on Newhart. Not that that's like a high-ranking achievement or anything. She had an Oscar. She had a Tony. Her Wikipedia page is sanitized of all of this. Ruth Gordon was 54 when Red Channels landed. She had been in Hollywood since the silent movies. She had been on Broadway. She had been an MGM star. How did Ruth Gordon get caught up in all this?
Ruth Gordon was married to Garson Kanin. Garson Kanin he'd started as an actor on Gertrude Berg's The Goldbergs. And then he became a playwright and a writer. They co-wrote a whole series of very popular Hepburn Tracy star vehicles. They wrote together Adam's Rib and Pat and Mike, all these kinds of feisty, 1940s style feminist films.
Sure. So she kind of was the voice of the Katharine Hepburn, aura.
Yeah.
What we saw was probably Ruth Gordon's words coming to life.
Right. And they were also very close to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and to Felix Frankfurter, who was then on the Supreme Court. These connections were all considered evidence of their communist affiliations. And so certainly because they were part of that New Deal community, that was one of the reasons that they were singled out. Also, Garson Kanin was enjoying some popularity. He had a hit film in 1950, Born Yesterday, starring the amazing Judy Holliday.
Yes, who was also on the list. Yes.
Yeah, who was also listed. So I think that these were some of the reasons. And Ruth Gordon also had a reputation in Hollywood for not backing down from her very principled opposition to racism and anti-Semitism. So all of these things combined in the eyes of anti-communists to confirm their opinion that she was a member of the Communist Party or a fellow traveler.
And she had some longevity to her. She lived into her 90s, and she was, I think, before Betty White was roped into being a host of Saturday Night Live at the age of 90. I think Ruth Gordon held the record for a couple of years there.
Listeners, I encourage you to follow Dr. Carol Stabile on Twitter at CASTABILE.
Carol Stabile, Castabile, and learn more about the book, including where to buy it, at her website, broadcast41.com. See your book buying options there, and that even includes that you can get it from independent online booksellers. They'll send it to you. You don't have to go to the big jungle. I want to acknowledge the editing and creative graphics work of Catherine Yang, the theme music of this show called Take Me Higher by Jazzer, and that's found on freemusicarchive.org. And I want to assure you all that the show notes and our website, tbherstory.com, will contain the links and the book titles as well. There you'll also find our social media handles, old episodes, and ways to contact and support the show. We're going to close out this episode with a fun Ruth Gordon interview from 1981 in which she discusses her career, yet never mentions the blacklist. Like, even listening to just this podcast, or maybe the first episode and this episode, has given you the knowledge to read or listen between her lines. Thanks for being with me today. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.
I wonder how it felt to you after being an established actress on stage in the United States and England.
Yes.
To have Hollywood sort of discover you and grant their acclaim and through the pictures like Rosemary's Baby and Harold and Maude and so forth, as though you were something brand new.
It just felt great.
Did it? Oh,
it feels great, and I don't care who discovers me and thinks I'm very good. It'll feel great, too. If it's a worm in the earth just breathes in his head and said, "You're great, Ruth, you're great," then that would be fine. I'm very common, and I just like any kind of praise, don't care where it comes from. I was born in Massachusetts. I got my inspiration from the theaters in Boston. I got to become an actress in New York, and in California, I got to become a success. And it's very interesting. You know, I was a fine actress here, and plays were successful, but people didn't go along the street and say, "I love you, I love you, I love you. I saw you in Harold and Maude 60 times." But it's not even movies that does that. Harold and Maude, very much so, but it's the TV, because you see, you and I are in somebody's parlor, somebody's bedroom, somebody's dining room, so they know us. And nobody ever called me Ruth on the street till TV.
And then they know you personally.
Now they say, "Ruth, hello, yeah. Ruth," because I'm at home.
And what that can do in the way of communicating, a real mass medium can do things that can't otherwise be done, I think. I'm thinking now of the movie Harold and Maude, in which you played a 79-year-old woman in love with a, I think, 20-year-old boy.